So this discussion, we're going to look at conferences. And the first part of the discussion is the reasons for conferences. Why are you going to conferences? Now, again, conferences, making proposals, attending conferences, the whole process is a very important part of the publication process because we'll talk a little bit later about a number of reasons, but this is the one area where before you need to publish, you can get some kind of feedback, you can learn about some of the critical issues in your field. And so it's a good way of preparing your paper before you're ready to publish it. So first we're going to look at the reasons for going to a conference. And obviously the main issue is sharing research. So you go to conference, often if you're presenting a paper, you can share your own research, and if you're just listening to other people's research, so this is a one way of putting your research out front beyond your own group. Now obviously that raises privacy concerns because there's always the chance that someone will take your research and use it for your own. That happened to me once. I have to admit, I didn't really ever try to publish my paper, but I was also very surprised to see a very similar design appear a few years later. Whenever you share anything, you have to sort of balance that with privacy issues. Another reason for going to a conference is to obtain feedback before publication. So if you have a presentation, hopefully people will ask you interesting questions or discussions, and those you can incorporate into the revised version of your paper. You have a good chance to network among colleagues, and again, both for personal reasons in terms of finding out what they're doing, and also professionally it could help you find a job or a position later on. Normally you find that people are more approachable at conferences than there may be in other times. It's like people go to conferences, so they expect other people to come up and talk to them. So it's a good opportunity to meet people. One of the factors, again, is to learn what are the controversies in your field, or what are the problems that you need to address. And again, this is very useful in terms of both formulating your research and revising your existing research. Often conferences are places you actually job hunt. So in the old days that was even more true. Nowadays there are more conferences on Skype or Zoom now, but often there were places where you would go, you would hand in your CVs, and you could even get interviews. And again, when I was in grad school, that was actually the predominant way of job hunting, was to attend conferences. And one of my favorite reasons for going to a conference is you get to look for books. So there's usually publisher displays. They usually have their latest books out, or their most important books. Often they give them away or at discounts. So it's a great chance to come home with a lot of books for reading. So in terms of choosing a conference, there's a number of factors you have to take in mind. There are international conferences, which often are large and in major cities, or often sometimes overseas. There are local conferences. If you're interested in starting small, sometimes that's a good first way of making a presentation. Those are conferences that are mainly for people in that region or area. There are small conferences. Sometimes these could be much better. Often small conferences are focused on one particular issue, so if your research happens to fit into that issue, that could be a very good way of going to a conference. And then there are large conferences that often have multiple threads. So sometimes you need to choose what area you want to present in, and when you make your application, what do you want to talk about. So for example, go to a conference, there may be a thread on teaching writing, or there may be a thread on literacy, but there are also lots of other threads that may or may not have interest. So when you go to the conference, often you have to choose, do you want to hear papers that you're familiar with, or you want to hear something in a field you may be less familiar with? So in a large conference, you have a better chance of getting a wider variety of papers to choose from. I like to say location, location, location. Again, large conferences tend to be in major cities. They need lots of hotel space. Small conferences often may be sponsored by universities. They may be in small towns. Again, there's a kind of intimacy to that, but you do sacrifice having to go to, to maybe a city that you're not particularly interested in visiting. And then the final point, of course, is there are fake predatory conferences. And just as there were predatory journals, nowadays there are predatory conferences. So you have to look at a number of factors, particularly the price of the conference, sometimes who's presenting there. Because, if you go to one of those conferences, you can't expect to get very good feedback, if any feedback. Sometimes those conferences are very broad in scope. They may be small, but they have people from all kinds of disciplines, and the chances are they're people who actually know what you're talking about are very slim. So normally if you want to present something at a conference, you have to have some kind of proposal, or even sometimes a short paper that you want to submit. There's usually a very specific format for the proposal and very strict word count. So a lot of times you're really presenting a abstract. Sometimes for research you haven't completed yet, so you have to kind of shape it in such a way as to make it sound appealing, even though you may or may not have actually done the research. Again, there's different kinds of conferences to do that. Sometimes there's some kind of rubric. Often the rubric is very similar to what we've been discussing about peer reviews. What's the significance of the paper for the audience? So remember, one of the purposes of the conference is that you want to have interesting papers that people will want to hear, and so it's up to you to kind of shape your proposal to make it sound interesting and relevant for the particular audience of the conference. Often conferences usually have evaluators. Sometimes you just volunteer. It's more difficult. They may have to evaluate multiple proposals, which they may or may not have experience with. So one time I was asked to read a bunch of proposals, and one of them was about Korean linguistics, which I happen to have no background in, so I had to find someone to help me. So you have to be sort of careful both about taking the evaluation too seriously. Conferences are a little different than journals in the fact that they want more people to come, because more people means more money. On the other hand, they're limited by how much space they have. Some more conferences are going online. Obviously now conferences either canceled or put online, but in general, they're a place for you to get together with other people. So there is this face-to-face component to it that's usually prevalent. Sometimes on proposals, they actually give you feedback. I've seen more and more a trend where they sometimes ask you to revise your proposal based on feedback. That can be positive or negative. Again, the people who are doing the reviewing are not necessarily the best qualified people. So it depends on how much you really want to go to the conference. Usually they give you a variety of types of presentations. And so one factor would be, do you want to give the presentation by yourself, or are you giving it with a group? There are sometimes time factors, so you might have to consider a short presentation. With a group, then you would have to divide that up, maybe 20 minutes for your group. But sometimes if you had a group and it was a very important proposal. Maybe you can get other people to give their own presentations, and you can have a much longer session. And so there are various types of presentations. They're sort of formal, this is my research, but there are also plenary presentations, which usually are chosen by the conference organizers, often to get people to come. There may be group presentations. There may be presentations by a selected group of people who share the same topic. Forums. Nowadays, I've seen a number of conferences where they want some kind of discussion sections. So they may ask for just to put a controversial issue in your field out there. And as I said, this one of the advantages of conferences is that they're often the fastest way of getting issues out there. So you have a better chance of hearing what's the latest research, the latest topics, the latest concerns, all of which then you can go back and incorporate into your papers. Posters are interesting. How valuable they are vary in different fields. I mean, I'm in a field where posters are not that valuable. In fact, one conference, if you reject the presentation, then you can ask the person if they want to submit that for a poster. In other fields, posters can be very important. They can look different. Some posters look like a mini research paper. They have a little bit of the introduction, a little bit of the literature review, and a little bit whatever you can get on one large piece of cardboard. Other posters can be highly visual. They do give you a good opportunity because in the that's what they have to do. They have to come up and talk to you. And so they're a very good opportunity to get feedback on your work. The question you have to ask is, how important are they going to be in evaluating your CV if you put them down on your CV? And that's going to, again, vary a great deal across different disciplines. So often you'll see with a conference, that where they create a theme for the conference. And one of my professors once did a study on incorporating the themes into the proposals and found that if you did that, you had a much greater chance of being accepted. And again, I don't know how universal that was or generalizable that was, but that is a possibility. So when you look at the conference, when they propose a conference, you might want to look at what the theme of the conference is. In this conference, for example, this is a writing conference. One of the most contested set of commonplaces, common understandings of our roles as teachers and scholars. And so you're going to, somehow incorporate that even in the title. You'll see a lot of times this theme incorporated in the title. So this is a conference that's going to focus a lot on teaching. So you see a lot of references, teaching subject, the cultural value of teaching, on practice space that is theoretically situated. So this gives you a clue as to what you have to focus your research on in your proposal. In this case, it would have to be teaching practice that has a theoretical basis to it, or there's evidence for it and research to support it, but the primary focus is on teaching. So that would give you a clue to how to shape your proposal. We'll talk a little bit later more specifically on preparing a presentation. You notice most of the time I've been using Prezi. You can also use PowerPoint. There's supposedly much different interaction between the presenter and the audience, although I'm not totally clear what's the difference between Prezi and PowerPoint. You do need to consider a number of layout issues, which we'll go into later. Just generally don't make each slide too crowded. I mean, even the way I do it, there's a lot of text on this slide, and it's probably not very good. So you have to kind of decide in making your Prezi or making your PowerPoint between how much text and how much images. You can make a whole PowerPoint based just on an image per slide. In the old days, when I was a grad student, um, you, you have to buy your own slides, and they were very expensive. So there was a lot of um, impetus for putting as much information as possible on one slide. Nowadays, obviously with PowerPoint, they're all free, so there's much less need to cram each slide with a lot of text. And initially, people did that when they transitioned from the old-fashioned way of overheads to PowerPoint. They tended to use the same format, but little by little, people realized that that's not a very good format. So, another is images. Something represents what you're doing. It could be your own figures or data, or it could be a picture, and then you talk over the image. So it's a better way, a more accessible way if you talk rather than just read what's on the slide. There's a number of rules for making presentations, mainly about how long they are. And a lot of times, depending on how the conference is organized, whether you're put into a panel with people or whether you're doing it by yourself, but they're very strict time limits. Usually you need to have some question periods so you can get some interaction. So a lot of times it's very good to, not only are you preparing your presentation, but you're preparing how long you're going to give it. You're going to need to decide whether you can talk over the presentation or whether you have to read a formal paper. The danger of reading is always that you just sort of look down at the paper and you don't look really at your audience, so you're not really engaging them. The advantage of reading is you know exactly how long it's going to take. And so that's always helpful in a conference situation. You have to know who your audience is. Every conference is different in terms of, is the audience people who know as much as you do, or is it a more general audience? Frequently at conferences nowadays, particularly the larger they are, the more general the audience is. So you have to sort of adapt your presentation to who you perceive the audience to be, and what is it they want. So since this is focusing on publication, conferences can be judged by how valuable they are for getting your paper published, either in a conference proceedings or maybe a book that's being made out of conference, particularly if it's a small conference. There's going to be a number of copyright issues and regarding whether what you say at a conference is going to be is considered pre-published. And also remember, ideas, if you just talk about ideas, those are not going to be copyrighted. They're going to be open and people can use them. And so you have to think about how giving a presentation on a particular topic might be considered future publication. And so again, this is one thing you may need to clarify with the editor, and to tell the editor whether that you presented this work somewhere. Now, a lot of times what you're presenting at a conference is not going to resemble the final paper, and that makes this issue less important. But if you're reading a paper, you're giving a paper that's going to look like a paper you plan to publish, then you have to be more careful about whether giving the paper at a conference is going to be considered prior publication. But the most important thing at a conference is to have a good time. It's a chance to visit new cities, meet new people. Often you sit around and talk to people, particularly at the end of the conference. If you're staying in a conference hotel with lots of other people, you're bound to run into people you like. I mean, sometimes the advantage of a small conference is that you can meet almost everybody. I remember the first conference I went to was very small, and actually the entire conference could sit around a swimming pool at night. And so it's a very sociable, people are in a very sociable mood, and that's why they go to conferences, to have a good time. And so take advantage of this as a trip out of town, get away from Columbus and areas like that, see something new, and that's really one of the big pushing points of going to a conference. Thank you.